Poisson, Verseau, Balance. Ça se trouve l'inverse. Ouais, mais comme j'ai le même que mon frère, bah. Ouais, mais sinon c'est des vraies formes, tu vois, et du coup ça prend trop de place.
So, we start from
Yeah, so last time we analyzed some of the engravings by Gustave Doré in his books written with Blanchard Gerald, a journalist, a British journalist. Doré was French, but Gerald was a British journalist, and in a book which they entitled London, a Pilgrimage. So we saw in several of these engravings the opposition between the few, once again, that is, the educated, the rich, the wealthy, those who have a voice and who can express a voice, and the many, represented by the poor, generally as either spectators of the rich, which is the case, for instance, in this first engraving, in which the poor people are focusing their gazes on the group of three educated men in the middle, or, on the contrary, as the poor are seen as spectators, or on the contrary, as the focus of attention. Well, here, obviously, again, the poor are presented as spectators. They are listening to the educated man reading out the Bible to them. But here, for instance, they are rather at the same time the actors of the scene, and at the same time, they are the actors and we are the spectators looking at their poverty. So all this, as we said, is quite characteristic of the way poverty was perceived at the time, perceived by the educated, perceived by the rich, and represented by the educated and the rich. And Gustave Doré's engravings are cases in point to show the type of perception there was on poverty at the time, and to show how poverty became visible through this kind of drawings or this kind of texts, which evoked life in a night refuge, or which evoked life in a coffee house, a Whitechapel coffee house, or life in a poor street like Dudley Street. So what shocked the Victorians at the time, the better off Victorians, I'd say, was the promiscuity of people, especially the fact that they seemed to be living that there seemed to be almost crowds living in a very confined space, as is the case, for instance, in this narrow street, with the impression of overcrowding, because there are so many people in the streets, and it seems that these people are almost living in the streets. You see how they, for a living, probably, they try to sell the shoes at the foot of their building. Probably they lived here, and this impression of overcrowding is particularly present in Dudley Street. The idleness of the people on the picture, or the apparent idleness, they were not idle in the sense that they worked from 5 o'clock in the morning till very late at night for most of them. But it seemed to the Victorians that they were idle because they were just, for some of them, in front of their houses and spending the day not doing much because not many people came to buy their shoes. So it seems that the women, especially here, at the front doors, you see here, are spending their days in idleness, as well as the children, instead of going to school. So this was part of what shocked the Victorians, and which added this notion of vice. Poverty was seen as a vice at the time. Very often the adjective vicious was used to refer to poverty. So once again, the point of view of educated, better off people on less educated and less well-off people. It's always the same voice speaking, as we've said. In the last two engravings, which we have not analyzed so far, you have more or less the same ideas. That is, except that in this one, the organ in the court, you can see an organ player here in the middle. Here's the focus of attention. This is one of the petty jobs that poor people did at the time. There were many street entertainers, and an organ, a musician like this, an organ player, was a street entertainer. And you see the attraction, obviously, to the organ player, especially with all the children surrounding him and seemingly very happy to hear him play the organ. So here it's a scene of poverty in the sense that the scene takes place in a poor neighborhood of the city, but it's a more positive, I would say, a more positive vision of the poor neighborhoods of the city, with children enjoying the music, and with this musician enjoying a kind of a fame almost, as if he was a great artist, with all these children flocking to him and trying to listen to him play the organ. But still, you see, you find the same representation of poor neighborhoods with very narrow alleys, as opposed to the wide avenues of the West End of London, for instance, with very little light. The engravings are very dark, I would say, to represent the darkness that was associated with such neighborhoods. Darkness not only in the sense of absence of light, in the physical meaning of the word, but also darkness in the sense of ignorance. You remember when we spoke about the vision that the Victorians had of foreigners at the time, we've said that Africa was called the dark continent. Well, the dark continent was also an expression that was used, well, maybe not continent, but the adjective dark, that was used to refer to the poor neighborhoods of Great Britain. For instance, there were several books written about dark London. And dark London didn't necessarily mean that there was no light. This was only the first level of meaning, but it also meant that it was a place in which people were deemed to be ignorant, in which they were deemed to lack the necessary knowledge to be happy and to live a normal life. Because this is how poverty was perceived, as a vice, and a vice was considered to be a sin. So if poverty was a sin, it meant that you could cure poverty through religion, which the reading of the scriptures by the man in the night refuge tends to indicate here, and to get rid of this sin, to get rid of this of this sin, of this vice that poverty was considered to be, then you had to find means to fight this sin or this vice, and some of them saw religion as the only means to cope with this. The last scene is different. It's a scene of utter poverty, with people who do not even have a refuge to sleep at night. They are asleep under the stars. How can you describe this picture, and how do you understand it? What does it show about Gustave Doré's perception of poverty and the way he wanted to stage poverty in this part, or in this picture in particular? It's different from the others. Why? Well, the background already is different from the others. I suppose if you look at the other pictures, you see here that well, I'm not speaking of the pictures representing the inside of a coffee house or the inside of a night refuge. Well, both of them are very dark, with only artificial light that focuses on some characters, here on the poor to better highlight poverty, and here as well on both the poor and the man reading out the scriptures to them. But if you look at the street scenes, you see here that the mass, because it's really a kind of massive, yes, a kind of massive block. The mass of the houses is very present. It's almost overpowering. It reinforces the darkness of the whole because, of course, the houses, well, with the perspective, it seems that the houses are endless. There is a row of endless houses, or an endless row of houses, rather, all looking very similar. There's this impression of monotony. And monotony is a word that was to be used by most urban explorers when they described poverty and when they described poor neighborhoods. Monotony. All the houses seem to be similar. All the people seem to be similar as well. There is no individuality, in fact. So this is why it was so easy to generalize from these, or to draw essentialist conclusions from these drawings, because the poor were always represented as a mass. Well, it was very rare to represent the poor as individuals with an individual personality. So this row, this endless row of houses, and also you see the sky. Well, you can see a part of the sky, but what can you say about the sky? It's a typical London sky, by the way, but it's very cloudy, foggy. We don't know exactly, maybe foggy. At the time, London was much more foggy, or was foggier than it is today, because there was the problem of chimney fires. And I think chimney fires were banned in the 1950s, and this stopped the smog there was over London. Well, there is still fog, of course, over London, but smog is now a thing of the past, because it is now forbidden to make a chimney fire in London houses. But at the time, there were many chimney fires. And because of all the smoke coming from the chimneys, there was this kind of smog, overpowering smog on the city. And this gives a very oppressive atmosphere, and it reinforces the darkness of the atmosphere. You have exactly the same idea here. You just see a very small part of the sky, and it doesn't seem to be an open sky, you know, the type of blue sky with, which seems to refer to freedom, which seems to refer to an opening. Well, here, there is this opening towards the sky, but the opening seems to be quite closed in a way, paradoxically. Here it's totally different, because the sky takes about, well, let's say 1/3 of the picture. And obviously it's not a foggy sky, it's a black sky. This is night, so the sky is black, but it's the presence of which shows it's the stars, yes, the stars in the background seems to be showing that this is a beautiful sky, a clear sky, well, at night, but a clear sky all the same. So for the first time here, we see this clear sky, and it seems that this clear sky is an invitation to freedom in a way. But there's this paradox and this opposition, this contrast with the scene underneath. The scene underneath, in which you can see a group of obviously very poor people, destitute people. It's typical of utter poverty here. A group of destitute people asleep under the stars. So they are obviously spending the night on a bench, kind of bench, outside in the streets, probably because they didn't find a place in a night refuge, in a workhouse. This was the case for many people every day. That is, you had to spend the day sometimes looking for a place in a workhouse. And if you spent the day looking for a place in a workhouse for the night, or in a night refuge for the night, it meant that you couldn't find a job. So sometimes they had to choose whether they wanted to try and find a job or to try and find a place for the night, a bed for the night. So obviously this group of people, maybe a family, you can see a woman here, an elderly man here, probably 2 men here, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 children probably. So either a family or a group of people, we don't know, of course. And they are spending the night sitting, which was very often the case even in night refuges, as I've told you. That is, sometimes they didn't have enough beds, so they used benches, and the people would sit on the benches and try to sleep on the benches. And so as to prevent them from falling down on the floor, they just used a rope, you know, to restrain all of them. And in the evening, someone would pull the rope, and then, well, some people fell down on the floor, but this is the way they were waken up, if you want, in the morning. So this is more or less the same thing, except that it's outside. So
can we say, compared to other pictures, I mean previous pictures, they are on their own? Because when we look at the other pictures, we have the presence of the house. At least they have a shelter at least, or the roof over them, but here they are on their own. As you said, you know, before when they were in a rural area, they had the community to help them.
Yeah.
But right now they are
they are completely alone. Yes,
yeah,
they are completely alone. There are a group, of course, but completely alone and completely. Yeah, this picture is really about how poor people could be completely alone and on their own. To find a job, to find a place to live, to find a place to sleep at night, and how the government, in a way, seemed to have given up on them in this particular picture. And you see the typical Victorian costumes of the time. The woman with a shawl. We'll see several films today representing Victorian, late Victorian and early Edwardian women, and working women generally wore a shawl on their heads. This was very common in the Victorian age, as you'll see. So she is the typical working woman. Well, the shawl was instead, well, rich women had a hat, and poor women wore a shawl because it was less expensive to wear a shawl. So they protected their hair, especially at work, I think, and especially as the hair was supposed to be there was a kind of sexual connotation in the hair, which was quite obvious at the time, and the shawl was a way of partly hiding the hair at the time. So you'll see in different films the fact that these working women very often wore this shawl, and better off women wore a hat, generally speaking. So it's this contrast between the beautiful sky and the scene of utter destitution that you have underneath, which is particularly striking here. And when you read the title, Asleep Under the Stars, this could almost be a positive title. You're asleep under the stars. This could be a beautiful night when you spend the night outside because you've chosen to spend the night outside because, I don't know, you wanted to enjoy nature. But obviously here, this is not the case. And it's the contrast between the asleep under the stars, which seems to be quite positive in itself, and the scene itself, the scene of utter destitution, which is particularly striking. So all these images, or this kind of images, of engravings, of reportage, as they sometimes say. All these writings as well, we'll see several examples of writing later on, they participated in making poverty more visible to everybody and in making people more aware of what there was to do, of what had to be done to fight this poverty. Several people, important people, politicians, for instance, at the end of the 19th century, declared that they could not understand how people could be poorer in Britain, next door, in the East End of London, for instance, poorer than they are in India or Africa. And they started to discover this. They started to discover, or to be aware, rather, to be aware of the fact through such pictures, through such texts written by urban explorers, they started to be aware of the fact that poverty existed next door, that poverty existed at home, that poverty was not only a characteristic of poorer countries, of countries in distant or of distant countries, but that it was also applied in Great Britain. And this is why you could find so many philanthropists at the time of in the late Victorian period, because there was this new visibility of poverty and because they wanted to do something to deal with poverty. Well, obviously what they did was not always the best way to fight against poverty. That is the evangelization part, or the religious part was not only the appropriate answer to deal with poverty, but at the time there were only a few laws that had been enacted to fight against poverty. There were especially what was called the Poor Laws. The Poor Laws tried to fight this phenomenon of poverty, and especially to offer alternatives for poor people. And it is through the Poor Laws, for instance, that the workhouses were developed. The workhouses in which the poor could go to spend the night and to eat, simply. There's a very famous scene at the beginning, I think it's at the beginning of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, when Oliver Twist, who is still a young child, is asking for more. He's in a workhouse and he wants more soup, more food. And it's a kind of rebellion from a little child who understands that these workhouses obviously were not enough. But the Poor Laws, well, this is not my point to study the legislation around this, but the Poor Laws were also the source of many criticisms by wealthier people who thought that the government should not do anything for the poor because the poor had sinned, and if they had sinned, they had to cope with their situation, a situation that they had created according to them. So there was this misconception of poverty which made it very difficult at the time to help the poor. And the first actions led by philanthropists, we'll see several examples in another class, were maybe a little awkward and maybe not adequate in terms of the means that they chose to fight poverty, but at least they were the first actions, and they led to other actions. Another action which may be quoted is what is called Dr. Barnardo's schools. Barnardo was a doctor. His schools still exist today, but now they are much more open than they were at the time. And he opened schools for destitute children. And it was a very a very strange way of doing. That is, he spent his time in the streets trying to spot smart children in the street in spite of their poverty. And once he had spotted a child whom he thought to be intelligent enough to be saved in a way from poverty, he enrolled the child in his school, in his school for poor children, and he tried to make something out of them. And they did work, these schools. They had quite interesting results at the time. And Dr. Barnardo became quite famous, and his schools still exist today, by the way, not only for poor children, but also for foreign children. And at the time, it was one of the actions which was not based on religion, or at least not based essentially on religion, and which did work as a way to fight poverty. But it was just for a few children whom he chose almost at random in the streets. It was not something systematic. So what you have to know at the time about the management of poverty is that there were very few national measures, except for the poor laws, except for the workhouses, for instance. So very few national measures, but many local measures by the local governments, and especially by individual people. Sometimes wealthy people, upper middle class people, or aristocrats who wanted to devote a part of their time to dealing with the problem of poverty. But poverty at the time was something particularly terrible. There is also, I would like to quote the baby farming system. I don't know if you've already heard about it. Baby farming, well, it seems to be quite a strange expression, baby farming, but this is exactly what it was. That is, it was the idea that when a woman had a child, a poor woman had a child, generally out of wedlock, that is, when the child was not the child of a husband, of a legitimate husband, or when she was not married. Well, at the time it was considered to be a sin to have a child out of wedlock. And even among poor girls, the fact of having a child out of wedlock was considered in a very negative light. And so there was a system for all those mothers who thought that they would not be able to deal with their child, or that either because they didn't have the money to do so, or because they didn't want to face the criticisms of others for being a single mother. There was this system of baby farming, which I discovered a few years ago. I had never heard about it, but it's an absolutely terrible system, which consisted in selling your child when you were poor, most of the time, selling your child to a baby farm. And a baby farm was a kind of house. It was not a farm in itself, but it was a kind of house in which generally there was one woman or two women allegedly taking care of the children, so a kind of foster house, except that the situation of children in baby farms was very often absolutely catastrophic. And there were many infamous cases, like the case of Amelia Dyer. Well, I do not mean that all baby farmers were like Amelia Dyer, but there were many of them who were like her. Maybe not as savage as her, but there were many medical reports at the time on the subject of baby farms. And what happened in these baby farms is that generally, well, this is how it worked. A woman wanted to sell a child. So she wrote a kind of ad in the newspapers saying that she wanted to give up a child, or more generally, it was the baby farmers themselves who wrote ads. Well, generally the ads were very positive. I'm a very nice woman. I would like to take care of a child because my husband and I do not have any children, or because we have a lovely family, a loving family, and we would be delightful to help you, etc. And then the woman who wanted to give up a child wrote, at the time there was no telephone, or well, it was not so much used at the time. So she wrote to the baby farmer. Generally she wrote to the newspaper, and they decided on the price. Generally either the woman would pay maybe £1 or £2 a month for the child to be taken care of, but generally the baby farmers preferred to be paid a lump sum, that is a full sum, and then the woman, the mother, would never see her child again, or at least would not, yes, she would not be, maybe not be allowed to see her child again, but generally they didn't see their child again. So generally they preferred these lump sums, so it was something like £15 for the child. Well, at the time it meant more than today, but still it was not a lot. So it was a kind of annual payment for the child, or sometimes even a general payment for the child. And then they met generally in a public place, generally at a station where everybody is anonymous. There are many people and everybody is anonymous. And they exchanged the child for the money. And what happened then, the mother never knew, because generally, especially if she had paid the full sum, she never saw the child again. And Amelia Dyer was arrested after maybe 30 years of baby farming, and she was accused of having killed probably more than 100 babies. And what she did is, and this was the case of many baby farmers at the time, not all of them, but many of them. Well, generally the babies were mistreated in these baby farms. They were called farms because they were treated like animals, you see. There are accounts of what happened in these baby farms, and accounts of for instance, baby farmers using egg boxes as a bed for the child. Well, probably a big egg box, but an egg box for the child, or never calling the doctor when the child was ill. And at the time when a baby died, there was a coroner's inquest into the death of the child, but generally the coroner's inquest did not go further. That is, the child had no mother, so nobody wanted to know why the child had died. And so Amelia Dyer, for instance, had about 100 children who died while she was a baby farmer, but nobody ever cared. It was only on the day when a woman who had not given up on her child, she had sold the child to Amelia Dyer, but she regularly wanted to be aware of how the child fared, and it is at this moment that she told the police that her child had died, and that she thought that he had been mistreated by Amelia Dyer, and it's only at this point that there was an inquiry into what Amelia Dyer did, and that it was discovered that she had probably killed about 100 children, and she had gotten rid of them in the river sometimes, or in the woods, or well, she was. I would like to show you the picture of Amelia Dyer, because she's absolutely fantastic. I would never have given a child to her. No, but you know, it's the mugshot. So on the mugshot, you always seem very, yeah, that's her. That's her, Amelia Dyer. Well, she was hanged for what she did. Yeah, she doesn't seem so nice. Yeah, so you see, poverty was this as well. And more people started to write about this, which made people more and more aware of the reality of what poor people went through. when they didn't have the money to face life.
Why these farmers bother themselves to adopt children?
Because they made money.
They force them to work? Just
No, they died, most of them died before. No, but when they had the 15 pounds, for instance, what Amelia Dyer did is that she took the 15 pounds and then she never fed the child, or barely fed the child, and then the child died within maybe 3 weeks, 1 month. So it didn't cost her anything, and she had the 15 pounds.
Them for working.
No, sometimes in the best baby farms, this is what they did. They used the children as well. There were baby farms which were more, I would say, more adequate, let's say, for children. And there was very often. Charles Dickens speaks very well about this, and he says that the parish, that is the religious men of the village, were very often part of the baby farm system as well, and not all of them, of course, wanted to kill the children. This is not what I'm saying, but as the children were the children of poor people. And as the poor people were so invisible at the time and so unimportant at the time, it meant that their life did not matter much. So it was a way for the women who gave up their child to these baby farms to try not to be criticized for having had a child out of wedlock, for instance, or to try simply to face life without a baby, because it was difficult for them to pay for the baby's expenses as well. And the baby farms most of the time made money out of these mothers. Very few baby farms did this to save the children. Well, some of them did, but very few of them. And then at the end of the century, the baby farms were more and more regulated with more and more inspections. So it started to change, but for a very long time, the situation of these destitute children did not matter. So justice closed its eye upon this. There was the coroner's inquest. The coroner's inquest said that the death was natural, and that was it. There was no police investigation. You know that in England, whenever there is a death, there is a coroner's inquest which is going to determine whether the death is suspicious or not. If the coroner says, and sometimes he was paid to say it, if the coroner says that the death is not suspicious, there is no police investigation. Wanted to ask something?
Yes, I wondered, do farmers ask for money?
Do farmers?
They asked for money from the mothers, or
Yeah. In the ad they said for $15 for 15 pounds for a lump sum. They called it a lump sum. A lump sum, c'est une somme globale. C'est pas quelque chose qu'on paye tous les mois. For a lump sum of 15 pounds, for instance, I can take care of your child indefinitely. So the woman paid $15 pounds, gave up the child, and that was it. And most mothers never saw the child again because they wanted to forget about the child. Well, some mothers did not forget about the child, and this is how Amelia Dyer was arrested by the police. But it's really a fascinating system. I discovered it a few years ago. I had never heard about it before. There are many medical investigations, medical journals written on this, and it's absolutely terrible to think that in Victorian Britain, things were like this. But it shows you, and this is why I wanted to mention it. It shows you how completely invisible the poor were, and even if more and more people started to speak of this, to write, journalists investigated into the situation of these baby farms and tried to show how disgusting it was to treat human beings like this. Well, before this interest in the matter, nobody cared. And even the parish, that is the religious authorities, turned a blind eye on what happened. Justice turned a blind eye on what happened. The coroner turned a blind eye on what happened. Journalists also turned a blind eye on what happened. So nobody cared. And all these children simply disappeared without anyone caring about them. Maybe without anyone knowing that they had ever existed sometimes. So this is the tragedy of the invisibility of the poor at the time, which started to disappear thanks to all these urban explorers who wrote about poverty. And even if, and this is what we'll see next time probably, even if the reasons beyond urban explorations, the reason beyond slumming were not always very good reasons. You remember the cartoon on slumming. Obviously, the aristocrats or the wealthy people who are here visiting the poor neighborhood are here for bad reasons. They want to be excited by the picture of poverty. They want to be thrilled by the picture of poverty. The adjective or the verb to thrill was very recurrently used when people went slumming. It was a thrilling experience, you know. So it's exactly as when you watch a thriller, it's a thrilling experience. Well, it was a little like this. So even if their reasons were not always good reasons, even if they were based on a large part of voyeurism, much more than noble reasons, they still participated in the new visibility of poverty. Another means which participated in the new visibility of poverty was the cinema. And I would like to, well, I have the CD here, but they are all on YouTube now, so it's easier to show them on YouTube. It's the films, it's a series of films, hundreds of films, that were found maybe 10, 15 years ago maximum. They had completely disappeared, and they were found during excavation works in a shop. I can't remember where exactly, Manchester maybe. And in a shop, they suddenly discovered at the back of the shop, when they destroyed a wall or something, they discovered hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of reels, films, short films, dating back to the late Victorian period, the first years of the 20th century. Films made by two men, Mitchell and Kenyon. Mitchell, M-I-T-C-H-E-L-L, and Kenyon, K-E-N-Y-O-N. And these two men were among the first cinema people in Britain, and especially the first to have made many documentaries on Edwardian life and late Victorian and Edwardian life at the time. So when historians discovered these films, of course, they were a gold mine to see with our own eye the Edwardians, the early Edwardians, late Victorians, moving around, discovering the seaside, working, etc., etc. So in Electric Edwardians, it's called, so I'm going to Google it. So Electric Edwardians, well, we're not going to watch the whole, of course, but I would like to show you a few extracts. The first one on youth and, well, yeah. The first one is on youth and education. So we'll start. I'm not sure you need the... It's mostly pictures. So, yeah, you see here, they explain. So their names are Sagar, Mitchell, and James Kenyon. So between 1900, some of them were filmed in 1898 or something like that. But generally, they are Edwardian films. So they were touring showmen. They were filmmakers, but they were commissioned by touring showmen. The touring showmen at the time were those people who, for instance, worked in a village fete or worked in town halls, village fete, local fairs, touring because they generally they were in one village one day, another village the other day, etc. So they toured a region, or they toured Britain, generally speaking, the United Kingdom. And at the time, there were no cinemas. There were no, as they said, purpose-built cinemas. That is, you didn't say, I'm going to the cinema tonight. There was no place which was called a cinema theatre. But films were shown, generally very short films at the time. You'll see a few minutes maximum. Films were shown in or at village fairs, at local fairs, at town halls, in music halls sometimes. And they were called local films for local people in the sense that they wanted, in fact, they wanted to show people the daily life of other people, including themselves. And what people liked the most was to recognize their face or recognize a neighbor's face on the screen. Imagine that it was the very beginning of the cinema. No, it has not much changed, by the way. But at the time, it was so new, of course, that it was something extraordinary. So you'll see how they filmed very daily, daily life scenes. The first part is on youth and education, and you'll see that they are especially interested in maybe not very poor children, but not wealthy children, obviously. And we'll see this part first.
In the summer of 1904, George Green commissioned Mitchell & Kenyon to film children leaving their schools. These are some of the most delightful films in the collection, illustrating the change in the Education Act, illustrating different aspects of the physical education regime that was brought in. George Green possibly showed these films at the Easter Fair in Blackburn and would have advertised to the parents, "Come and see your children on the screen." The films were shown as part of a 15-minute bioscope presentation. Other advertisements at the time tell us that the local children were always invited to the premier attraction on the fair and were part of the audience and shouted to the screen, "Look at me, I can see myself on the screen." Part of the exercise that the children are doing appeared to be an early form of calisthenics, marketed by the army and a part of a physical education regime.
Alors les parades, c'était quelque chose de très à la mode à l'époque.
The school children scenes were very popular, not only with the children and the parents, but also in terms of the showmen, who commissioned these as another form of local pictures to follow on from the factory gate exits from the early 1900s. George Green had been associated with the heartlands of Mitchell & Kenyon from the very early days and had commissioned films as early as 1898 for Mitchell & Kenyon to be shown, and his cinematograph show in Preston and Blackburn. Now, we see the children waving to the camera. This is an example quite often in the films of Mitchell and Kenyon, and often instigated by the cameraman behind, actually asking the children to express their appreciation of being filmed. Before the introduction of the Education Act from 1902, most of these children would have been working in the factories.
sortie d'école par les habits.
When Mitchell and Kenyon came to Morecambe, they were actually working in partnership with A.D. Thomas of Thomas Edison Picture Company, and these formed part of a very successful group of films which are shown at the Winter Gardens in Morecambe. The Church Lads Brigade at Drill was filmed in Morecambe and actually shown the same evening at the Winter Gardens. You see the parade of the Church Boys Brigade. You also see the crowd reacting to being filmed, because Thomas Edison advertises, "Watch it, Edison's operators are about. Come and see yourselves on the screen." So the responding of the camera is very much part of the publicity. The boys now are acting and doing their drill and their military exercises. The young boy in the front loses his place and then tries to maintain military discipline and doesn't actually succeed, as you see in the following scene. When they were advertised, the actual brochure proclaimed, "It's a happy idea that the management has hit upon to include in the collection a wonderful scene of the Morecambe Church Lads at Drill." Needless to say, these pictures are followed with intense interest, and if you happen to be on the front when the photograph was taken, you can see yourselves in the same attitude as when the machine was passing. The film was shown at the Winter Gardens Music Hall on July the 3rd, 1901. Edison's show continued for 2 successful months in Morecambe, and so popular with the Church Lads at Drill, this film was also shown in other venues throughout the north of England. Now we see the customary surge of the crowd wanting to see themselves on the screen. This was filmed on the 6th of July 1901 and actually is the opening ceremony of the degree procession at the University of Birmingham, where the new intake of women graduates actually received their degree. The local newspaper report at the time says that when the first woman graduate came to receive her degree from Joseph Chamberlain, the Chancellor, one of the students in the audience shouted the advice, "Kiss her, give her a cuddle," when she went up to receive her degree. It's difficult to ascertain which one of the ladies is actually the person who received their first degree from the university. However, the local report tells us that with a slight blush and a merry smile, the first girl from the University of Birmingham graduated, mounted the steps and approached the Chancellor and was greeted with cheers and loud applause from the audacious students in the audience. The operators with the straw boaters are actually part of Thomas Edison's camera crew, and this film was shown as part of a 2-month series at the Curzon Hall under the management of Waller Jeffs.
Bon, ça c'est autre chose. Alors, juste un petit point là-dessus. Oui, donc comme, yeah, as they explained, very often the scenes were staged. That is, they were asked to wave to the camera, they were asked to smile, they were asked, it was not just filming someone like this without telling them beforehand. So it was really a staged scene, but immediately, generally, in the evening or the next day, they screened the films in a music hall, in a fete, in a fair, and people liked going there. Well, she explains that they were very popular films at the time, and that some of them were screened for 2 months in a row, especially the one with the church boys doing their drills, you know, with the one losing the, well, incapable of keeping up with the rhythm of the drills. So these scenes, especially as they showed for most of them children from the lower middle class, or even for some of them, at one point she said in the first school scenes that these children, before the Education Act of 1902, would have worked in factories instead of being at school. So they were mostly, if they had worked in factories, it means that they were poor children, or lower middle class children, even working class children. So this was also a way to show poor children, for instance, exactly in the same way as accounts by urban explorers made them more visible. These films made them more visible as well. And when we look at them, we smile, we find them particularly happy, it seems, to be in front of the camera, etc. But you have to know that such scenes sometimes shocked some of the Victorians or early Edwardians. For instance, the scenes in which all the children are waving and shouting, etc. This was typically the type of scene that would shock some Victorians, because they considered that children didn't have to be like this, that they shouldn't behave like this, they shouldn't shout in the street and wave at the camera like this. So what we see as spontaneity in the films was very often read very differently by the wealthy people at the time. Even someone like Sigmund Freud thought that these films were shocking, and that some street scenes in these films were particularly disappointing, according to him, because he didn't want to see people in the streets behaving like this. So what we see as something spontaneous and quite pleasant in a way today was not always considered in this way at the time. And most of the public who watched these films came from the lower middle class or the working class. That is, these films were especially for the same type of public as the people that had been filmed, if you want. And while the others could be shocked sometimes at the scenes themselves. The fact that the boy, for instance, can't keep up with the rhythm, well, is something quite pleasant, something quite spontaneous, something which makes us smile today, but which would probably have upset, you know, the Puritan Victorian, for whom military precision was something really very important. Well, not all of them reacted this way, of course, but some of them did. And you find accounts by many famous people speaking about this. I'm not sure it's the right one. Je retrouve le bon morceau. Attends, je regarde. C'est le 3. faut qu'il se... Hein. Sauf que je ne vois pas le... Voilà, vous êtes là. Alors, on va aller maintenant... Bon, après, c'est sur la guerre des bourgs, mais ensuite, il y a des scènes devant les... Opening of the... Quoi? Oh boy. Non, general. Donc là, on est toujours sur la guerre des bourgs. Alors maintenant, on va passer sur des scènes qui sont... Là, c'est toujours la guerre. C'est là qu'il devrait y avoir quelque chose.
C'est ça, surtout Télé6. Je pense,
je cherche les scènes de... Voilà, par exemple. Donc ça, ce sont des scènes de sortie d'usine. Ils ont beaucoup fait comme les frères Lumière, des scènes de sortie d'usine. Il faut simplement que le truc se charge. Et où là, vous allez voir, alors regardez bien, parce que ça vous permet de voir des pauvres de l'époque, alors des working poor, c'est-à-dire pas les plus pauvres, hein, mais enfin malgré tout quand même très pauvres. Et vous allez voir la différence entre les personnes que vous allez voir et celles qu'on vous décrit dans les textes de l'époque. C'est assez intéressant de comparer. Alors, 35 par contre, non, je vais essayer de faire autrement parce que... Alors, voilà. Donc, ce sont des sorties d'usine. Hein. Ah.
Cinematograph company. This is very typical of the factory gate films filmed in the Lancashire heartland and the cotton factories.
Vous voyez les chats sur les têtes des femmes.
It would have been shown in July 1901 for use on the Fairground Bioscope show. The children seen in front of the camera would have been child workers. The smaller ones are obviously taking their father's or their mother's lunch to work and can be seen holding the food and standing in front of the camera. All the workforce can be seen wearing clogs, and now we have one of the first stars of the Michelin Canyon films responding with his impish grin to the camera. Unlike other films made by Lumiere and Edison, the operators actually encourage this kind of behaviour in front of the camera and show the vitality and physicality of the audience responding to being filmed. The operators are now organising some kind of procession in front of the camera. However, our two urchins in the middle frame refuse to respond. When Michelin Canyon and the showman turned to film many of the factory gate exits in 1900 and 1901, they were usually met by a positive response from the audience and also from the factory owners. When they actually came to Rawmarsh to film Parkgate Iron Steel Company rather in 1901, the reaction is not seen to be quite so popular by the local workforce. This would have been filmed on behalf of a fairground exhibitor to be shown at Rotherham Status, the local wakes fair, held in November every year, a chartered fair known locally as the Status. Over 6,000 people worked for Parkgate Company, and now we see the people queuing up for their pay at dinner time. Some of them responding to the camera with great joy and vivacity. However, now we get the first example of a V-sign in film history where the aggressive manner, where he now says almost like "come and take you on if you think I'm hard enough," is not typical of the usual behaviour of people being filmed by Mitchell and Kenyon. We also have an actual fight on camera, not obvious if it was staged by the showman. There seems to be a roughness, which is not actually purely staged for the camera. Again, the children leaving would have been half-time workers, and the more smartly attired gentlemen would have been the actual management. This pan shot shows the variety of workforce ranging from 10, 11-year-old boys upwards to elderly gentlemen. Again, the reaction to the camera can be seen here now, where the operators of Mitchell and Kenyon are actually waving to the cameraman to stop filming. One of the rare examples in the collection of not just women working, but also a working scene from the seaside. Filmed in North Shields, it shows women who followed the Scottish fleet as it came down the coast and filleting and selling the fish. The women of North Shields were renowned for their independent nature. The gentleman now wearing the white hat is actually working for Tweedale, another one of the commissioners associated with Mitchell and Kenyon. We see here the fish being ready, and now Tweedale is actually staging an impromptu bartering scene within the film and a mock battle reminiscent of the other fiction films made by Mitchell and Kenyon at the time. The blurring of fiction and reality is apparent within this title. The Tweedale operator is also seen now manhandling one of the punters, and again incorporating an element of showmanship into the scene. In 1901 by Mitchell and Kenyon in association with Ralph Tringle. The National Maritime Museum believes this film to be the Skirmisher, which would have been the vessel that would have actually then transported the passengers to the main ocean-going liner, showing scenes of the second and third class passengers. itself, ship's crew in front of the camera is reminiscent of the Factory Gate titles. Also, aspects of the film again resemble a home movie, with the cat on the ship taking a starring role in this section.
Peut-être juste, je sais pas si c'est le premier, si c'est le premier on regarde. Oui, si, parce que ça c'est une fête justement. Donc c'est toujours la même population.
The Whitsuntide Festival was filmed on behalf of George Green. It shows wonderful examples of the Edwardian fair. The switchback gondola, now shown, was one of the technological marvels of the age. Over 150 fairs took place every week in the United Kingdom, and this scene is intercut with scenes of Preston Market, one of the medieval market towns still remaining. The visit of the annual fair was one of the most looked for attractions of the year, and George Green combined this by showing scenes of the fairground in his bioscope show that night. The roundabouts on display in the film would have cost on average £3,000. But the advent of the cinematograph show in the 1900s proved as popular, and now we see green cinematograph where this film would actually have been shown that evening.
Okay, so what are your reactions to this, or to these scenes, especially the Factory Gate
session was filmed in June 1901 and actually forms part of many.
The Factory Gate scenes, as they're called, which filmed, in fact, people leaving their job, workers for most of them. You could see the owners of the factory as well with their top hat sometimes, but the majority of the people were the working class, obviously. Exactly as in the fun fair that we've just seen, the majority of the people there were from the lower middle class or the working class. What's your impression when you watch these people? Do they seem to be so degraded, lacking vitality, ignorant, etc.? Well, ignorant, it's difficult to know, but do they seem to be, do they look like the animals that the urban explorers of the time described? Not at all. Not at all. So I think it's very interesting to see the contrast between the films, which even if they were partly staged, filmed the reality of these people, the way they looked, the way they behaved, the way they, well, maybe not they spoke, because we can't, this was silent cinema, but the way they behaved, the way they gestured, the way they joked, the way they played together, the way sometimes they fought together, as we've seen, and to compare it with the descriptions written by the urban explorers about the same class of people, presenting them as degraded animals, almost objects, anonymous things. And we'll find exactly the same opposition in a text which I'd like to focus on now, a text by Jack London. Jack London was, well, he was the great journalist and a novelist that you know, an American journalist and novelist. And in 1903, he was sent by a newspaper to investigate into the poverty of London. So he was a kind of American reporter investigating into the poverty in London. And from his experience in the East End of London, he wrote The People of the Abyss. The People of the Abyss, which was published in 1903. And already in the title, you know what is going to do. He calls the people of the East End the people of the abyss, as if the East End was a kind of big black hole into which people fell and from which they could never come back. So this is the author's preface to the book. The experiences related in this volume fell to me in the summer of 1902. I went down into the underworld of London with an attitude of mind which I may best liken to that of the explorer. I was open to be convinced by the evidence of my eyes rather than by the teachings of those who had not seen or by the words of those who had seen and gone before. Further, I took with me certain simple criteria with which to measure the life of the underworld. That which made for more life, for physical and spiritual health, was good. That which made for less life, which hurt and dwarfed and distorted life, was bad. You see, it's quite a Manichaean approach. There was the good and the bad. He presents himself as almost a scientific journalist. That is, he says that he is not going to be influenced by the urban explorers who explored London before him. So he wants to be as objective as possible. This is what he says. He says at one point that he wants to write his text from a tabula rasa. That is, he wants to forget about all the texts that were written before and to make up his own mind on what he was going to see. Well, you'll see that the result is very different from what he said he would do. I have taken an extract from his text. It is chapter 19. It's called The Ghetto. The ghetto was mostly the Jewish ghetto, but he uses this term not only to speak of the Jewish population, but to speak of the poor, generally speaking. And the very quotation that he uses at the beginning as an introduction to his text, to his chapter: city children soak and blacken soul and sense in city slime. There among the gloomy alleys, progress halts on palsied feet. Crime and hunger cast our maidens by the thousand on the streets. So it's already a poem by Lord Alfred Tennyson, a great poet of the 19th century. And you see already he speaks of child poverty, child destitution, of the blackened soul of children in poverty. The city slime, the slime is the mud, so it's also very negative. The gloomy alleys in which progress is impossible. The notion of disease, palsied feet, crime, hunger, and the maidens cast by the thousand on the street, prostitution. So you see that from the start, the quote that he uses is not neutral at all, and already indicates what he is going to show. And the text itself is the following. So he speaks of the notion of the ghetto, the fact that in Europe, generally, the Jews were discarded to the ghettos, confined to the ghettos, because they were unwanted. And what he wants to show in this paragraph is that the British government does the same with its poor. That is, that they confine the poor in a ghetto, which becomes almost invisible because it's not seen from outsiders or by outsiders. And this is the image that he uses. East London is such a ghetto where the rich and the powerful do not dwell, and the traveller does not come, and where 2 million workers swarm, procreate, and die. And you see the first three verbs that he uses to speak of the poor. They swarm. Generally, you use this verb in which context? To swarm.
For insects?
For insects, absolutely, when there are many insects, and he did fourmiller. Swarm. Procreate, that is, human beings, the poor, are reduced to their procreation dimension. The problem being implicitly for Jack London that if they procreate, they also create more poor people and die. So you see how he reduces the existence of the poor to swarming, procreating, and dying. The word living is not even used. And you already see the contrast between the pictures that we've seen in the films of people who, of course, were poor, but who seemed to be very dynamic, very, well, I'm not saying that their life was a simple life, but they seem to be living, at least, and not only reduced to swarming, procreating, and dying. So then he explains why the East End is the focus of his investigation, and then he's going to describe what he calls this city of slums. So the city of dreadful monotony, the East End is often called, especially by well-fed, optimistic sightseers who look over the surface of things and are merely shocked by the intolerable sameness and meanness of it all. If the East End is worthy of no worse title than the city of dreadful monotony, and if working people are unworthy of variety and beauty and surprise, it would not be such a bad place in which to live. But the East End does merit a worse title. It should be called the city of degradation. While it is not a city of slums, as some people imagine, it may well be said to be one gigantic slum. From the standpoint of simple decency and clean manhood and womanhood, any mean street of all its mean streets is a slum, where sights and sounds abound which neither you nor I would care to have our children see and hear, is a place where no man's children should live and see and hear. Where you and I would not care to have our wives pass their lives is a place where no other man's wife should have to pass her life. For here, in the East End, the obscenities and brute vulgarities of life are rampant. There is no privacy, the bad corrupts the good, and all fester together. Innocent childhood is sweet and beautiful, but in East London, innocence is a fleeting thing, and you must catch them before they crawl out of the cradle, or you will find the very babes as unholy wise as you. So, have a look at the images, the metaphors, and the vocabulary, generally speaking, that Jack London uses here to describe the poor and their life. What can you say? First, the notion I had mentioned before, this notion of monotony, sameness. This impression that everybody looks like the others. This impression that all houses are similar. This impression that all streets are similar. This is typically the impression you have when you arrive in a foreign country and you see only the surface of things. And you have the impression that all the people look like one another. And then when you get to know them, of course, they don't look like one another. You see what I mean? When you arrive somewhere you do not know, you see the striking, the generalities, the surface of things. But you don't enter into the details. So you're not aware of the variety of the people, of the streets, etc. When you arrive in a foreign country, for instance, you see that the housing is completely different from ours. And then you may have the impression that the housing is the same everywhere, whereas it's not, of course. In France, houses are different from one region to another, and even within one region, houses are very different according to, depending on the neighborhoods, etc. But this is the first impression you have. And typically, this is the impression of an outsider entering the East End and finding everything looking the same because he's not used to this type of neighborhood. So the notion of monotony and monotony associated with dreadful. That is a monotony which is not reassuring, a monotony which is degrading in a way. And then he goes a step further, saying that it's not only the city of dreadful monotony, but the city of degradation. And degradation, of course, is going a step further. So he speaks of a slum, he speaks of the sights, the sounds, the lack of decency. This is something that was very recurrent as well at the time, speaking about the poor. The promiscuity, the fact that they lived in crowded rooms, and this implied promiscuity with men and women, for instance, or different families sleeping in the same room, which was considered not decent. And then the notion of obscenity, vulgarities, the notion of being rampant, of festering, which is more or less the same as swarming. So once again, a reference to insect more than a human being. And the notion of spoiling, the fact that innocence can be spoiled in a second in this environment. And again, speaking of the babies crawling out of the cradle, well, a baby can crawl, but obviously crawl also has an animal-like dimension in this particular context. So the vocabulary is animalizing the poor, obviously, degrading them, and what is quite interesting in London's text is that he illustrates his text with photographs taken by himself. He was a photographer at the same time, and what he did was mostly photojournalism, we would call this today. And what's interesting is to contrast what he describes in words and what we see on the sepia pictures. Is this scene, to you, a scene of utter destitution? Not particularly. Not particularly. Well, this was a scene to which, obviously, he was not used, or he was no longer used, because he explains that he was poor in the past in America. But now he's become a famous journalist and writer, so he leads a different life. So this is obviously a scene or the inside of a house to which he is not used, but it's not particularly a scene of degradation, destitution, or whatever you may like. You see a woman probably doing her laundry. Well, the house is quite... it's decorated, quite nicely decorated. So it doesn't seem to be completely abandoned. It doesn't seem to be completely decayed. If you look at the other pictures, look at the scene. Well, it's a picture with many children and women outside in a street, but you can't say that the scene is one of destitution or is one of degradation. The children are simply enjoying themselves in the street, which was shocking at the time because children were not supposed to spend the day outside in the street, but Otherwise, there's obviously a contrast, exactly as with the films, between what we can see on the pictures and the way he describes the same pictures. Take another picture, for instance, this one. Yeah, this one. So this is another example. Well, sorry, I can't. Yeah, it's difficult. Or this one. Well, you can't say that the clothes are particularly ragged. You can't say that the men look particularly degraded. They seem to be absolutely normal human beings. So it's very important. This is why I'm showing you these pictures and why I showed you the films themselves. It's very important to understand that the way the urban explorers, including Jack London, who said that he would not be influenced by the other urban explorers, the way they saw poverty was obviously a very subjective way to see poverty. So I'd like you to take a few minutes to look at, yes, for instance, here. Class supremacy can rest only on class degradation. And when the workers are segregated in the ghetto, they cannot escape the consequent degradation. A short and stunted people is created, a breed strikingly differentiated from their master's breed, a pavement folk, as it were, lacking stamina and strength. The men become caricatures of what physical men ought to be, and their women and children are pale and anemic, with eyes ringed darkly, who stoop and slouch, and are early twisted out of all shapeliness and beauty. C'est particulièrement dur comme description. Once again, reducing them to animals, they are a breed. They are a breed. A short and stunted people is created, a breed strikingly differentiated from their master's breed. And almost, through the use of breed, almost the idea, and we'll find it in other texts of the time, the idea that the poor are a race apart. The poor are a race apart. And this is why the descriptions of the poor are so much alike the descriptions of foreigners at the time, because they were considered a race apart. And Jack London, who obviously is a socialist, and who was a socialist, and who obviously here defends socialist ideas, class supremacy can rest only on class degradation. This is typically a socialist discourse of the time. Well, even though he defends the poor, he still reduces them to the state of animals. They are a breed apart, they are a race apart, completely different from their masters. He calls them a pavement folk. A pavement folk to, how do you understand a pavement folk? Someone who lives, who spends his life outside, simply. Someone who spends his life outside, whereas he should spend part of his life inside. So a pavement folk, a street folk, in a way. Lacking stamina and strength, so he seems to be implying that, and which was partly true, of course, the fact that many people from the poor neighborhoods suffered from different diseases. But he makes of it a generality, as if all the people from the working class lacked strength, lacked stamina. This is not exactly the impression that we had when we saw, for instance, when we watched the films by Mitchell and Kenyon. So obviously there's a generalization here from a few very actual examples. He drew generalizations about the poor in general. The men become caricatures of what physical men ought to be. So there's the very Victorian outlook on men. Men should be physical men. Men should be strong. Men should be healthy. And the women and children are pale and anemic, with eyes ringed darkly, who stoop and slouch and are early twisted out of all shapeliness and beauty. What does it mean, stoop and slouch? Stooping and slouching is being like this, you know. Is this the impression you got from the films? Not particularly. Which doesn't mean that there were no poor people slouching and stooping. This is not what I mean. I do not want to generalize myself. But which means that obviously from a few examples that he witnessed in the East End, he took the more sensational cases to generalize about the poor in general, presenting them as a race of slouching, stooping people in bad health. Well, this is not exactly the impression that you get when you see the picture. Nobody's slouching or stooping in the picture. So you immediately see I would say, the contrast between what he wrote and what he photographed at the time.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Was there somebody in that time that told the truth? Because as we see the descriptions telling very exaggeration description we have, and when you look at the photos, we have the very
there's a contrast between the two. Yeah.
And
There were very few. No, because poverty was a new phenomenon in the sense that it was newly visible. So people were so shocked by what they saw. I think they were sincerely shocked because they could not imagine that poverty could exist in a country like the United Kingdom. So they were shocked by, for instance, the fact that the houses did not look like the respectable Victorian households. And this is what made them draw these conclusions in a way. So you find very few accounts by Victorians themselves trying to be less exaggerated about the way they perceive reality. They perceive poverty. Sorry. No, you find very few accounts on this. It's rather historians today who tend to say, well, this is obviously exaggeration. Well, he was right about certain parts of the East End, but the East End was certainly not the place of lack of health, lack of hygiene that Jack London or other urban explorers described at the time. No, it was just that it's exactly, this is why I took the image of the foreign country. You discover a foreign country and you very often tend to exaggerate the more striking characteristics that you've seen first. And then when you get to know the country, then your impression is going to change, obviously. So it's exactly like this. Very often they compared going to the East End to going to a foreign country and exploring a distant land. So I think this explains, and what also explains these descriptions is the love of Victorians for morbid details. They loved morbid details. They were fascinated by morbid details. À l'époque, je parlais des coroners tout à l'heure, les coroners donc, faisaient une première inquest, ça s'appelle, c'est une enquête, mais c'est une inquest, donc dès qu'il y avait une mort qui pouvait paraître suspecte. Et à l'époque, ça aussi j'ai découvert ça il y a 1 ou 2 ans en lisant des articles, à l'époque en fait, c'était les coroners qui faisaient, vous avez déjà vu dans les séries britanniques ou américaines, les coroners font les autopsies. Hein. Et à l'époque, les autopsies se faisaient, tenez-vous bien, dans des pubs. Quand les pubs étaient vides, donc ils allaient faire les autopsies parce qu'il y avait que là qu'il y avait de la place pour mettre sur les tables le corps, sans doute, pour l'autopsier. Et à l'époque, en fait, et on voit des dessins qui le représentent, il y avait des centaines de Victoriens qui faisaient la queue pour aller voir l'autopsie. Hein? Donc c'était un spectacle en soi, l'autopsie. C'était le côté morbide du spectacle. Oui, c'était un truc assez à la mode aussi. Donc il y avait ce côté pour le morbide, hein, la plupart des shows, etc. C'était toujours des trucs assez morbides, assez, notamment pour tout ce qui était populaire, hein, bien sûr, mais pour les plus riches, bon, ils faisaient comme si ça les choquait, mais ils aimaient bien aussi aller s'encanailler et aller voir ce type de... Donc ça, le fait de lire ce genre de choses, ça ne pouvait que les renforcer dans leur sentiment de toute puissance aussi. Hein, donc il y a aussi ça, je pense, qui doit être pris en compte. Yeah, look at what he says. The men who are left, a deteriorated stock left to undergo still further deterioration has impoverished those who are left, a sadly degraded remainder for the great part, which in the ghetto sinks to the deepest depths. The wine of life has been drawn off to spill itself in blood and progeny over the rest of the earth. Those that remain are the lees, and they are segregated and steeped in themselves. They become indecent and bestial. When they kill with their hands, and then stupidly surrender themselves to the executioners. There is no splendid audacity about their transgressions. They gauge a mate with a dull knife, or beat his head in with an iron pot, and then sit down and wait for the police. Wife beating is the masculine prerogative of matrimony. They wear remarkable boots of brass and iron, and when they have polished up the mother of their children with a black eye or so, they knock her down and proceed to trample her very much as a Western stallion tramples a rattlesnake. So you see the vocabulary. You see the vocabulary. You see the... And at one point he says, I think it's here, it's at the end, no. Yeah, here. As I say, the young are high-strung, nervous, excitable. The middle-aged are empty-headed, stolid and stupid. It's absurd to think for an instant that they can compete with the workers of the New World. Brutalized, degraded and dull, the ghetto folk will be unable to render efficient service to England in the world struggle for industrial supremacy, which economists declare has already begun. Neither as workers nor as soldiers can they come up to the mark when England in her need calls upon them, her forgotten ones, as if England be flung out of the world's industrial orbit. They will perish like flies at the end of summer, or, with England critically situated and with them made desperate as wild beasts, and made desperate, they may become a menace and go swelling down to the West End to return the slumming the West End has done in the East. In which case, before rapid fire guns and the modern machinery of warfare, they will perish the more swiftly and easily. So here they're not only beasts, they're just flies. Flies that you can crush in a second. So you see here, it's at the same time written in defense of this class, but at the same time, the tone used to describe them and to essentialize them, to present them as all the same and all reduced to this kind of bestial existence, degraded existence, is at the same time very contrasted with the socialist approach, which claims to help these people. So, on the one hand, this distance that obviously Jack London puts between himself and the people he describes, those people, the beasts, the wild beasts, or even less than wild beasts, the insects that can be crushed by the machinery of war, or simply by the machinery of the government, or the machinery of the rich, and his socialist ideals, which seem to be completely in opposition to the way he describes these poor people. Take another example. This one is by a British journalist this time, late 19th century, 1889. It's about Whitechapel, so it's exactly the same place which is being described. A dozen graphically written descriptions of Whitechapel by people who have never seen the place but have heard as much about it as most have would probably be as amusing in the reading to those acquainted with the district as the most extravagant of the fables once so frequently quoted as articles of current French belief in the matter of English manners and customs ever were to the English people themselves. Et là, il commence la description. A horrible black labyrinth, think many people, reeking from end to end with the vilest exhalations, its streets mere kennels of horrid putrefaction, its every wall, its every object slimy with the indigenous ooze of the place, swarming with human vermin, whose trade is robbery and whose recreation is murder. The catacombs of London darker, more tortuous and more dangerous than those of Rome, and supersaturated with foul life. Others imagine Whitechapel in a pitiful aspect, outcast London, black and nasty still, a wilderness of crazy dens into which pallid wastrels crawl to die, where several families lie in each fetid room, and fathers, mothers and children watch each other starve, where bony, blear-eyed wretches, with everything beautiful, brave and worthy crushed out of them, and nothing of the glory and nobleness and jollity of this world within the rage of their crippled senses, rasp away their puny lives in the style of the sweater. Such spots as these there certainly are in Whitechapel and in other places, but generalities are rarely true. And when applied to a district of London as large, so large as that comprised under the name of Whitechapel, never. So this article is interesting because it starts from the general assumptions about Whitechapel, general assumptions that are drawn from all the accounts that were published at the time on Whitechapel. And he has made, it's quite interesting because he has made a kind of recap, a kind of condensed summary of all the metaphors used in these texts to refer to Whitechapel. And again, you see it's always the same, the notion of darkness, the catacombs of London darker, more tortuous and dangerous, the notion of danger, the notion of putrefaction, degradation, well, these are more or less the same. The verb to swarm, it was a verb that was almost always used in such contexts, to swarm. The notion of human vermin, insects as well. The smells, the vilest exhalations. Murders, of course, murders. The notion of wilderness, wild wilderness. Also starvation, of course, a lack of health. Yeah, and the notion of the sweater. So it's all the vocabulary that was generally used to generalize about Whitechapel or about poverty. And he starts from this to say that this is exaggerated, and he's writing, or he wrote this text in 1889, that this is exaggerated, and that the East End, of course, contains pockets of, let's say, destitution, in which you may see such scenes of degradation, but generally speaking, the neighborhood, as he explains, the neighborhood is much more varied than this, with a very lively atmosphere, because there are many markets, there are many people in the streets, street entertainers, street sellers, etc. So a very lively atmosphere all around, with all the different markets. He speaks of the Aldgate meat market here. A variety of people as well. Many public houses, with many people going from and into the public houses. And then he's going to describe what he calls, there are many other evidences of the commercial respectability of Whitechapel. So Arthur Morrison was one of the only journalists of the time to try to re-establish the reality about Whitechapel. Whitechapel, which had become an infamous neighborhood. The article was written in 1889. That is 1 year after Jack the Ripper's murders. And when Jack the Ripper killed the 5 or 6 prostitutes that he killed, or that he allegedly killed, there were many articles written in the newspapers about the foulness of Whitechapel, about the fetid life that the prostitutes led in Whitechapel. And this fed the fantasies of the Victorians about the East End and about poverty. The Jack the Ripper case was really instrumental in, at the same time, making poverty more visible, because for the first time, all the newspapers in the country spoke about what had happened to these prostitutes, and they spoke about the neighborhood, and they spoke about poverty, and what could be done to fight this poverty. So, indirectly, Jack the Ripper participated in the new visibility of poverty in London. But at the same time, they also made so many generalizations about Whitechapel that, of course, people had a completely distorted vision of the neighborhood. And with people like Jack London, a famous journalist, reinforcing the prejudices by writing even more cliches about the neighborhood, of course, you may imagine why the vision of the poor was so distorted at the time. So this is another example, and we don't have time to study it, but maybe we'll have a look at it next time. It's the article by James Greenwood in Strange Company, being the experiences of a roving correspondent. We'll have a look at it later. It's typical of Jack London's writing as well, with a very negative outlook on poverty. Voilà, bon, ça s'arrête là pour aujourd'hui.